When I picture it in my mind, I see a whole army, about 20,000 men, marching straight into enemy land like they owned the place. These guys were loaded with weapons, confident, seasoned, the kind of soldiers who'd seen battle more times than they could count. And yet, within just 2 days, 48 hours, not a single one of them was still breathing. Every last one of them was gone. Not one survivor. But here's the part that still sends a chill down my spine. They didn't fall in a heroic fight. They weren't lined up and executed. They were buried alive. All of them. They went into the ground screaming, trapped under mountains of dirt, while their queen sat back on her golden throne, sipping wine like she was watching a play. And the wildest part? She smiled while it happened. Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably thinking, all right, that's gotta be some old legend people exaggerated over the years. Believe me, I thought the same. But then I saw the archaeological reports. Massive burial pits filled with thousands of skeletons. And every one of them showed signs that the people were still alive when the dirt covered them. You could see it in the way their fingers were twisted upward, clawing desperately at the earth. Their jaws stuck open like they were frozen mid-scream. And the awful truth? This wasn't some isolated event. This queen pulled this stunt over and over again. For 3 straight decades, she used this method to turn war into something so terrifying that enemy soldiers would rather end their own lives than risk being captured. Her name alone could make entire groups of men desert before a battle even started. Some commanders went so far as to fake their own deaths just to avoid crossing her. That woman was Queen Razia of the Khorasan Empire. And trust me, once you hear her story, she'll haunt your imagination more than any horror movie villain. Because what I'm about to share isn't just another tale about ancient wars or dusty political struggles. It's the story of how one woman figured out the most powerful psychological weapon on the planet. Cold, calculated fear. And she didn't just use it, she reveled in it. She built an empire so massive it made Rome, at its height, look like someone's backyard. But here's the question that always hooked me. How does a teenage girl, sold off as a slave, rise to command armies and bury thousands of men alive? How does someone go from being literal property to becoming the most feared ruler the world has ever seen? The truth is darker than anything you're expecting. So buckle up. This is the unbelievable, real story of Queen Razia. And no, she wasn't born into royalty. I always say I wasn't just born into poverty. I was born straight into hell. Back in the year 1021, in what we now call Afghanistan, I came into this world already belonging to someone. My mother was a slave, nobody knew who my father was, and everyone assumed my whole life was already mapped out for me. Servitude, mistreatment, and an early grave. But funny enough, when I look back on it now, those early years taught me the harshest and most important truth I would ever learn. People who show mercy are usually the first ones who are denied it. That idea didn't just sit with me, it shaped everything I eventually became. When I was only 7 years old, I saw something that stuck in my mind like a splinter. It was awful, but it also sparked the twisted strategy I'd later become infamous for. The warlord who owned my family wanted to punish some slaves who had tried to escape. Instead of executing them on the spot, he had them buried upright in the courtyard, only their heads left above the ground. For 3 long days, I watched them die inch by inch. The sun blistered their skin. Insects crawled over them and fed on them. They begged anyone who passed to end it quickly. And every single day, I had to walk right past them. Their eyes locked on mine, pleading. Something cracked inside me then. Or maybe, if I'm being honest, something new came alive. When I turned 12, I was sold again, this time to a Persian merchant. He noticed something strange about me almost immediately. Somehow, just by studying the grain sacks and the messy scribbles in his ledgers, I had taught myself how to read. That caught his attention. Instead of tossing me into some kitchen or stable, he brought me into his household as a companion for his daughter. And for the first time in my entire life, I had something I'd never had before: books, an education, and a front row seat to how real power operated. I watched that merchant closely. I studied how he handled deals, how he manipulated prices, how he outsmarted rivals. He didn't use swords. He used information. And that was when I realized something I would repeat many times later. Knowledge is the only blade that never gets dull. Now, his daughter, Gulnar, she became my first real friend. And eventually, my first real betrayal. When I was 15, she pinned a theft on me to hide the fact that she'd been stealing from her own father for years. If things had gone normally, I would have lost my hand over the accusation. But I didn't beg, and I didn't try to talk my way out of it. Instead, I laid out every detail of what Gulnar had been doing. The amounts she'd taken, where she hid her stash, and who she'd been secretly selling things to. I'd gathered it all quietly over years, just by paying attention. The damage was instant. Gulnar was cut off from her family, and I was granted my freedom. But here's the twist. I didn't walk away. Instead of running off into the world as a newly freed girl, I made a move that surprised everyone. I asked the merchant for one favor, the chance to manage one of his trade routes for a single year. If I doubled his profits, I wanted a partnership. If I failed, I promised I would return to slavery on my own. He agreed, maybe because he was amused, or maybe because he saw the potential in me long before I fully understood it myself. But for me, this was about much more than selling goods. Trade routes in Central Asia weren't just roads, they were the arteries of information. Every traveler, every soldier, every merchant carried stories, secrets, rumors, and I soaked up every bit of it like a sponge. Within 6 months, I hadn't only doubled his profits. By that point, I hadn't just doubled the merchant's profits. I'd tripled them. But honestly, the money wasn't the most valuable thing I walked away with. What mattered far more was the network I'd built. I suddenly had eyes and ears scattered all across the region. I knew which noble families were drowning in debt, which generals were itching for promotion, and which cities had walls so thin that a stiff breeze could have knocked them over. With those connections, I stopped dealing in silk and spices and started trading something far more dangerous. Secrets. I used to say, gold can buy you someone's service? Sure. But secrets? Secrets can buy you the people who give the orders. And by the time I turned 18, I'd collected enough money and enough blackmail to make my next move. The regional governor, Hassan, was a vicious man who'd been skimming tax money for years. I had every crime of his written down, organized, and ready to bring down on his head. But instead of exposing him, I offered him a different path. I told him he could marry me, make me his legal wife, and in return, I'd keep his secrets buried and help him build even more power. Hassan was scared, greedy, and cornered, so he said yes. The marriage lasted exactly 13 months. Then he died under what people politely called mysterious circumstances. The official story was that he choked on a grape. The unofficial version? Let's just say there were details nobody wanted to dig too deeply into. Either way, I inherited everything, his title, his land, his wealth. But the most interesting detail is what happened the night he died. I invited every one of his political enemies to join us for dinner, and while they sat at my table, Hassan conveniently met his end elsewhere. They all had perfect alibis, thanks to me, and that meant every one of them owed me. I was 19 years old and suddenly in charge of a small province. But I wasn't satisfied. The entire Khorasan Empire was splintering apart, warlords clawing for land and power. And I saw something nobody else seemed to notice. In a world falling into chaos, you didn't need the largest army. You needed the one that terrified people the most. I didn't want to outnumber my enemies. I wanted to break them before they ever raised a sword. That's when the part of me people like to call genius, or sometimes madness, started to come out. My first real test arrived when a warlord named Mahmud marched toward my territory with 8,000 soldiers. I barely had 2,000. By any normal military logic, I should have been wiped off the map. But here's what historians always get wrong. I never planned to fight him the normal way. 3 days before Mahmud's forces even saw my borders, strange little things began happening in his camp. Soldiers woke up to find small piles of dirt beside their sleeping mats, tiny mounds shaped like fresh graves. Their bread tasted gritty, mixed with soil. Every stream or well they tried to use had been muddied. And then came the rumors. Villagers, shaking, whispering, acting like they were scared out of their minds. kept telling Mahmud's men stories about the grave queen. This woman who could bury entire armies alive, who could command the ground itself to swallow her enemies. What the soldiers didn't know was that those villagers worked for me, and I'd been preparing this psychological ambush for months. So when our two armies finally faced each other, I pulled a move no commander had ever dared. I had my troops start digging a gigantic pit right where Mahmud's soldiers could see every scoop of dirt. What we were digging that day wasn't some defensive trench or clever bit of fortification. It was obviously meant to be a mass grave. And once it was finished, I sent Mahmud a simple message. I've already dug your grave. You can lie in it today, or you can serve me and live. That one line hit his army harder than any weapon ever could. Half of his men deserted before sunrise. But it was what happened to the ones who stayed that cemented my name in history, and in nightmares. The soldiers who didn't run soon discovered the truth. My forces had been preparing that battlefield for months. We'd built hidden pits all across the plains, covered by thin layers of earth that could hold a man's weight, until it suddenly couldn't. Whole sections of ground collapsed the moment Mahmud's troops charged forward. Within hours, hundreds of his soldiers were trapped in those pits, thrashing and clawing, unable to escape. And then came the part that people still whisper about to this day. I ordered the pits filled, not with bodies, with living men. We buried them alive, their screams echoing across the valley long after the last handful of dirt fell. Mahmud himself was captured and presented with a choice. Stand there and watch his men die slowly, or join them. He chose to die with them, but I made sure he served a different purpose. I had him buried vertically, with only his head sticking above the ground like a warning sign. He lasted 3 days like that, 3 full days for every passing soldier and traveler to see what defiance cost. The psychological fallout was immediate and overwhelming. Within a single year, I took 12 provinces without fighting a single traditional battle. Entire armies simply vanished at the rumor of my approach. Cities surrendered outright to avoid their soldiers ending up under a mountain of soil. Before I even realized it, my territory stretched from what's now Iran all the way to Pakistan. And at my peak, I ruled not because I had the strongest army, but because I commanded something far more powerful. Pure, unfiltered terror. I technically had 30,000 soldiers under my command, but I hardly ever needed them. My reputation marched ahead of me like its own army. Foreign ambassadors who visited my court described scenes that probably haunted them forever. My palace courtyard was built with glass plates set over shallow graves. Condemned prisoners buried underneath, fully visible to anyone walking above. I held meetings like that, calmly discussing trade and diplomacy, while the doomed men beneath my throne gasped their last breaths. But fear, at least the kind I wielded, has one fatal flaw: it always demands more. The moment it stops growing, it starts dying. And when fear begins to fade, people stop obeying. They get bold. They get reckless. They get dangerous. Somewhere along the way, I became addicted to the fear itself. Servants later told tales, probably all true, about how I'd spend hours kneeling over those glass graves, studying the expressions of the dying, like I was trying to read something in their faces. I barely slept anymore. Every night, I jolted awake convinced someone was about to bury me the way I had buried so many others. And my paranoia didn't stop there. I started demanding that my generals prove their loyalty by burying their own soldiers for minor mistakes. I created a special corps I called the Earth Guard, whose only job was to dig graves ahead of me wherever I traveled. Entire fields of holes followed me like shadows. But while I was building this empire of fear, back in Baghdad people had started whispering. The Caliph, the man who technically ruled the entire Islamic world, had brushed me off for years, writing me off as nothing more than some troublesome provincial warlord. That was about to change. Before long, the stories about what I'd done, the mass graves, the armies swallowed by the earth, had spread far beyond my borders. People in Baghdad couldn't pretend I was just some distant problem anymore. Religious leaders began condemning me outright, insisting my methods were an insult to any honorable death. And even worse, a few of my own generals began to waver. One of them was Yusuf, a man who had stood by my side for 5 years without once questioning my decisions. But the day I ordered him to bury a group of surrendered prisoners, he finally snapped. His exact words, written down by court scribes, were, "My queen, we have become the monsters we once fought against." I didn't hesitate. I had him buried alive in the throne room right in front of everyone. That should have been the end of the problem. Instead, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because I made one fatal mistake. I let his brother Omar watch. I didn't know it then, but that single moment lit the fuse that would eventually blow my entire empire apart. Omar quietly began gathering allies, old enemies of mine, even a few friends, spreading one simple message: the grave queen must be stopped, or we'll all end up underground. And in the winter of 1051, everything started to fall apart at once. Omar's conspiracy had grown bigger than I ever imagined. 20 of my most trusted commanders were now plotting behind my back. They studied me carefully, watching every habit, every fear, and they realized something important. The same psychological terror I had used on the world could be used against me. They began subtly, almost gently, in a twisted way. I'd wake up to find tiny piles of soil on my bed, shaped the way I used to leave them for enemy soldiers. My wine tasted gritty, as if dirt had been mixed in. My mirrors were smeared with mud. To anyone else, these would have been harmless pranks. But after 30 years of using the earth itself as my weapon, these little signs cut straight into my mind. I began to unravel. I became convinced the ground had turned against me, that the earth itself was trying to bury me slowly. I stopped eating because I believed the food was tainted with soil. I refused to walk on natural ground. I had my throne lifted high onto wooden platforms so I wouldn't be too close to the dirt. My mind was cracking piece by piece. As I lost my grip, the empire lost its grip on fear. Provinces that had bowed to me out of terror sensed weakness and rebelled. My enemies grew bolder, and the coalition against me moved in. Then, on the night of March 15th, 1051, Omar and his conspirators made their move. They didn't storm the palace with swords. They sealed every door and window shut. Then they began funneling tons of dirt inside through hidden channels. The very weapon I had built my empire on became the instrument of my destruction. I was trapped in the throne room with only a handful of loyal guards. And as the dirt rose around us, first to our knees, then our waists, then pressing up against our chests, I finally understood the terror I had forced on thousands of others. History says I didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't fight. I just whispered. The earth always reclaims its own. I was 47 years old when I died, smothered beneath the weight of the same ground I had used to dominate the world. But here's the haunting part. When they dug out the room 3 days later, they found me perched on my throne. As the soil rose, I had climbed higher, gripping the armrests until the last breath left my body. Even in death, I didn't let go of my power. Afterward, Omar and the other conspirators tore down everything I had created. They destroyed the burial pits, freed the survivors, and tried desperately to erase every trace of my reign. But memories, especially the terrifying kind, don't disappear like bodies do. And the ones who paid the highest price were the regular people caught in the crossfire. Archaeologists have uncovered mass graves with over 50,000 bodies, all showing signs of being buried alive. Entire generations grew up dreaming of suffocating dirt pressing down on them. If my story proves anything, it's that power can be built entirely on psychological manipulation. I never had the biggest army, the best weapons, or fortifications that could stop an invasion. What I had was a deep understanding of human fear, how to shape it, how to sharpen it, and how to use it like a blade. But in the end, that blade turned on me. I began as a slave girl watching people die in the dirt, and I ended as a queen dying in the same way. Historians love to point out the poetic justice in that. But here's the twist. My methods didn't die with me. When you look at the way warfare evolved after my time, you can actually see my shadow stretching across history. Military historians have traced all kinds of psychological tactics, especially the threat of a humiliating or dishonorable death, straight through later conflicts and even into modern strategy. The whole idea that how a person dies can matter just as much as whether they die well, that's my dark little contribution to the art of war. Some scholars try to soften the truth, saying I was just a product of a brutal era and that plenty of rulers back then were just as cruel. Others argue I crossed lines that even hardened medieval warriors wouldn't touch. But the one thing everyone agrees on is this: I proved something terrifying. A small force, if it knows how to break minds instead of bodies, can overwhelm armies 10 times its size. In a strange way, I was thinking ahead of my time. I realized war wasn't only about stacking up bodies on a battlefield. It was about crushing the will to fight. So I used the earth, the thing every soldier relied on, as a weapon. The ground they marched on, slept on, trusted. I turned it into something they feared. Every single step my enemies took reminded them they might be standing on their own grave. Modern military psychologists still study my campaigns, pointing to them as early examples of environmental manipulation, how the landscape itself can be twisted into a tool that wrecks morale. The fear of being buried alive, they'll tell you, hits the most primitive parts of the human brain. The darkness, the suffocation, the feeling of being trapped with no way out. I found the ultimate psychological weapon, and I used it without hesitation. Now look, as horrific as Queen Razia's story is, and trust me, I know how dark it gets, I still wouldn't call myself the most creatively cruel ruler in the record books. If you want to see someone who took cruelty to a whole different level, check out the absolutely insane tale of Emperor Kong. That man didn't bury his enemies. No, he turned them into furniture. Literal living chairs and tables in his throne room. People who were forced to serve as human objects for decades. Some of them survived like that for 30 years. 30 years unable to move, unable to speak, unable to die, just existing as props. Honestly, it makes being buried alive sound merciful by comparison. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me through this wild story. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it fascinating in a dark, historical kind of way. And I'll catch you in the next one.